They laughed at her beauty, mocked her crown, and doubted her intellect before she even opened her mouth. But when Victoria Stevens walked into her new class, the world shifted. The same students who questioned her place now had no choice but to watch in awe as she shattered their expectations, solving complex problems with a brilliance no one saw coming. What happens when the underestimated girl rises to prove everyone wrong? Watch as Victoria takes on more than just equations. She takes on a world that never believed in her. The sun shone brightly in the small town of York County, where the streets were lined with blooming flowers, their vibrant colors dancing in the warm spring breeze. The air was sweet, carrying the gentle scent of freshly cut grass and blossoms that seemed to paint the world in shades of pink, purple, and gold. It was the perfect day for a celebration, and York County was buzzing with excitement. The reason for all the excitement: the Miss Teens York County pageant had just concluded, and the winner was none other than Victoria Stevens. Victoria, at just 11 years old, had a charm that captivated everyone in the room the moment she stepped onto the stage. Her beauty was undeniable. Her long, chestnut-brown hair cascaded in waves down her back, and her bright green eyes sparkled with intelligence. Her skin, soft and glowing, complemented her graceful smile that could light up even the darkest room. But while many admired her physical beauty, what truly set Victoria apart was something far more extraordinary: her intelligence. Victoria's mother, a former pageant queen herself, had been grooming her daughter for this moment since she was a little girl. She wasn't just training Victoria to be beautiful. She was training her to be strong, smart, and confident. The final round of the pageant, which had everyone on the edge of their seats, asked a difficult question that many thought might trip up the contestants. It was a question that required not only knowledge but also sharp reasoning and logic. "How would you explain the importance of balance in life?" the judge had asked. Victoria, with a calm grace, had answered with a depth that took everyone by surprise. "Balance in life is about understanding that every decision we make has consequences, just as in nature, where the smallest imbalance can affect an entire ecosystem. Every action we take should be carefully thought out. We must balance our desires with our responsibilities, our dreams with our realities. Life is like a scale, and we must ensure that both sides are equally weighted to find true happiness." The judges, along with the audience, were stunned into silence. Victoria's response was more than just words. It was wisdom far beyond her years. The crowd erupted into applause, and she was crowned Miss Teens York County. The sash, shining brightly with the title, was draped over her shoulders, marking the beginning of what seemed to be a bright future in the world of pageantry. Her victory was celebrated by everyone. Her mother, beaming with pride, hugged her tightly, whispering words of love and congratulations. "You were perfect, my darling," her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew you had it in you." Victoria's smile widened, her heart swelling with gratitude. But even in that moment of triumph, there was a part of her that longed for something more. A chance to prove that her intelligence wasn't just about winning pageants or impressing judges. She wanted to show everyone that she was more than just the pretty face who could answer a question well. She wanted to be respected for her mind, her ability to solve problems, and her unwavering determination. The transition to school. But as she walked into school the following Monday, the atmosphere was different. The excitement of her victory seemed to follow her, but instead of the admiration she expected, there were whispers. Whispers about the pageant queen, about how she had won, about how she had answered the question. Her classmates watched her closely, some with curiosity, others with doubt. Victoria had always been admired for her grace and beauty, but now that beauty seemed to overshadow everything else. Her classmates, many of whom were the top students in the class, couldn't help but wonder, was she just a pretty face, or was there something more to her? Victoria could feel the weight of their eyes on her. She walked into the classroom, her head held high, but her heart fluttered nervously in her chest. She had been placed in the advanced math class, where the brightest students gathered to solve problems that made others hesitate. But when she entered the classroom, she immediately felt the difference. The students exchanged curious glances, some even rolling their eyes. They whispered about her beauty, about how she must be a pageant queen who only cared about clothes and makeup, not math. Her new teacher, Mr. Jackson, a stern man in his mid-40s, didn't seem to have any faith in her either. He had a reputation for being tough and critical, especially when it came to students who weren't part of the elite academic group. When he saw Victoria walk into his classroom, his first instinct was to dismiss her. He didn't believe in pageant winners being able to solve complex equations. She was just a pretty face, surely with nothing more to offer. Victoria sat down quietly at her desk, her fingers gripping her pencil tightly. She had always been good at math, one of the few subjects that allowed her mind to race and find the answers she sought. But as Mr. Jackson walked toward the chalkboard, she felt the weight of his gaze on her. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the room, and then he called her name. "Victoria Stevens," he said, his voice cold and distant. "Come up to the board and solve this equation." Victoria's heart skipped a beat, but she rose from her seat, her movements graceful, her head held high. She walked to the board, her mind already racing through the steps to solve the problem. As she stood there, chalk in hand, she could feel the eyes of her classmates on her. They were watching, waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to falter. The problem Mr. Jackson had written on the board was complex, but not beyond her abilities. It was a problem that required both logic and precision, two things Victoria excelled at. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and then began to work through the problem step by step. As she solved the equation, her classmates grew quiet, unsure of what to think. Mr. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he watched her, his arms crossed in front of his chest. He expected her to make a mistake. But to his surprise, Victoria solved the problem with ease, her handwriting neat and precise. When she finished, she turned to face the class, her heart pounding in her chest. Mr. Jackson's face betrayed no emotion, but his eyes flickered with something he hadn't expected: respect. He had underestimated her, but she had proven him wrong. All eyes were on Victoria, who stood at the front of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she held the chalk. Her mind raced, but she kept her posture straight, her head held high. She had answered the problem to the best of her ability, but doubt lingered in the air. Mr. Jackson stood across from her, his arms crossed and eyes narrowed, looking for any mistake, ready to pounce on anything that could prove her wrong. Her classmates shifted uneasily in their seats, some still skeptical, others quietly impressed, but all uncertain about the unconventional approach Victoria had used to solve the problem. She had done it in a way that Mr. Jackson hadn't expected, using her own method to arrive at the answer. She knew it was right, but the uncertainty in the room made her second-guess herself. Mr. Jackson opened his mouth to speak, but before he could criticize her work, a voice interrupted him. It was Mr. Phillip, the advanced math teacher, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room. His calm, steady voice cut through the tension. "Actually, Mr. Jackson," Mr. Phillip began, stepping forward, "I believe this approach works. It's unconventional, but it's correct." He walked closer to the board, his gaze scanning the chalk-filled solution that Victoria had written. There was no mistake in her work. It was clear, methodical, and above all, it showcased a unique way of thinking, something that Mr. Jackson failed to see. Turning to the class, Mr. Phillip addressed them with a tone of encouragement. "Sometimes the best solutions don't come from following the rules strictly," he said. "This is a great example of thinking outside the box. It's a reminder that there's more than one way to approach a problem, and that's exactly how great thinkers evolve." Victoria stood there, her heart pounding. She had expected the usual ridicule, the dismissal of her ideas, but Mr. Phillip's words were like a balm to her bruised confidence. She glanced around at her classmates, some now nodding, others looking at her with a new kind of respect. The whispers had died down, replaced by a tentative silence as they processed what had just happened. But the tension wasn't over yet. Mr. Jackson, though taken aback by Mr. Phillips' intervention, wasn't quite ready to concede. His pride, and perhaps his belief in the old-fashioned methods, still clung to him. He stood for a moment, looking at Victoria's work as though he might challenge her once more. Just then, the door to the classroom opened, and in walked the head teacher, Mrs. Sullivan. She had been standing just outside the door, overhearing the exchange. Her presence, commanding and reassuring, immediately brought a new energy to the room. She had always been known for her fair yet firm approach to teaching, and today she stood as a mediator in the growing divide. "Victoria, your approach is valid," she said, her voice calm yet filled with authority. "And Mr. Jackson," she continued, turning to the teacher who was still holding on to his skepticism, "you must remember that learning isn't always about following one path. It's about discovering new ways to solve problems and empowering students to think for themselves." Her words hung in the air like a gentle yet firm reminder of the principles that should guide education, encouraging students to explore and find their own solutions, rather than restricting them to a single, predetermined method. The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of Mrs. Sullivan's words settled in. Mr. Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time that day, he seemed uncertain. He stood there, processing what had been said, before giving a reluctant nod. Victoria felt a shift inside her, a moment of release. She had been seen. Her way of thinking had been validated. And most importantly, she wasn't alone in this room of doubt and skepticism. The head teacher, along with Mr. Phillip, had given her the recognition she deserved. The tension in the classroom finally broke. The students, who had once looked at her with doubt, began to look at her differently. Some even leaned in to ask her about her method, wanting to learn more. Victoria's heart swelled with a quiet pride. She had done it. She had stood up for herself and proven that intelligence wasn't about conforming to others' expectations. It was about finding her own path. As she returned to her seat, the students began to whisper again. But this time, it was different. They weren't whispering about her being wrong or out of place. Instead, they were talking about how she had done something they hadn't expected, how she had solved the problem in a way that was both impressive and unique. Mr. Jackson, though still reserved, had been forced to recognize Victoria's talent. She had shown him, and the rest of the class, that there was more to learning than just following the rules. The unconventional could be just as valuable as the traditional, maybe even more so. Victoria smiled to herself, the weight of the skepticism lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't just a girl who answered questions, she was a thinker, and nothing could take that away from her. The weeks that followed were a test of Victoria's resilience. Despite the subtle whispers behind her back and the constant skepticism from her classmates, she held her ground. Mr. Phillip's support had given her a sense of confidence that was hard to shake. Every time she solved a problem in class, she did so with a quiet determination, drawing on the creative methods she had developed. But the more she excelled, the more the whispers grew. Some students still didn't believe in her, dismissing her achievements as luck or gimmicks. To them, Victoria was still just the beauty queen, the girl who won a pageant, not the intelligent, thoughtful student she had become. But none of that deterred her. Victoria knew her worth. She wasn't just the charming, pretty girl. She was smart, capable, and determined to prove it. Then came the day of the exam. The whole class had been preparing for weeks, and the pressure was palpable. Victoria sat in her seat, carefully reading the instructions, her pen ready. The questions were tough, challenging in ways she hadn't expected. But as she worked through the problems, she felt the familiar sense of clarity and ease that came with thinking outside the box. When the exam ended, Victoria was both relieved and nervous. She had done her best, but would it be enough to prove herself? As the students filed into the auditorium for the results, she could feel the weight of the moment. Mr. Jackson stood at the front, a clipboard in his hand, and he began reading out the names of the top scorers. As usual, the top spots were expected to go to the students who followed traditional methods, the ones who followed the rules and played by the book. But when Mr. Jackson finally got to the last name, the one that everyone had been waiting for, he paused. There was a long silence before he spoke. "Victoria Stevens," he announced, his voice thick with frustration. The room went quiet. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. She stood up slowly, not sure if she had heard him correctly. She walked toward the stage, her classmates' eyes on her, some wide with disbelief, others filled with admiration. Mr. Jackson's face had turned a deep shade of red. He couldn't hide the frustration on his face. The girl he had doubted, the one he had tried so hard to undermine, had topped the class. Beside her, the head teacher, Mrs. Sullivan, smiled warmly, her eyes filled with pride. "Victoria, congratulations," she said, shaking her hand. "This is a well-earned achievement." Victoria beamed. She had done it. She had proven herself. No longer was she just the pageant girl. No longer was she dismissed because of her beauty or her past. In that moment, she was seen for who she truly was, a brilliant, creative, and determined student. As the applause filled the room, Victoria caught sight of her classmates. They were no longer whispering. Some even stood to applaud her, their faces now showing respect and recognition. Samantha and Olivia, who had once mocked her, exchanged a look before clapping, albeit reluctantly. The students who had doubted her were now forced to acknowledge that Victoria Stevens was more than just a pretty face. She was a force to be reckoned with. Mr. Jackson, though still red-faced, couldn't deny the results. The numbers didn't lie. His once dismissive attitude toward Victoria was now replaced with begrudging respect. He nodded silently as she stood beside him, her back straight, her confidence shining through. Victoria looked out at her classmates, the weight of their previous skepticism now lifted. She was no longer an outsider in their eyes. They saw her for the intelligent, capable young girl she was, and she knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. This was the moment that would define her not only as a student, but as a person who refused to be underestimated. As she walked off the stage, her heart filled with pride. Her hard work, her creativity, and her belief in herself had paid off. Victoria Stevens had done it. She had proven everyone wrong, including herself. And as she walked back to her seat, Mrs. Sullivan leaned over to her and whispered, "You've done more than pass a test, Victoria. You've shown everyone that true brilliance isn't about fitting into a mold. It's about breaking it." As the weeks passed, Victoria's confidence continued to soar. What started as a quiet victory in the classroom blossomed into something much bigger. No longer the shy girl who had to fight for respect, Victoria became a beacon of inspiration in her school. Her unconventional methods of solving problems, once met with doubt, were now the subject of admiration. Her classmates, who had once whispered behind her back, now approached her for guidance. Geraldine and Maureen, who had been her harshest critics, began asking Victoria for help with their math assignments. Victoria, always patient and kind, took the time to explain her methods in a way that was easy to understand. It wasn't long before they were no longer just asking for help. They were genuinely interested in learning from her. Victoria had a natural way of breaking down complex problems into simple steps. She taught her classmates to think critically, to see problems from different angles. Her ability to see connections where others saw roadblocks became her trademark. Every day, more and more students came to her for advice, not just in math, but in other subjects as well. She wasn't just the pageant girl anymore. She was the girl who helped others succeed, the one they could rely on. Even Mr. Jackson, who had initially doubted her, found himself turning to her for answers. Though he didn't always admit it aloud, it was clear he had developed a grudging respect for Victoria. He watched, sometimes with a furrowed brow, as she solved problems in ways that were completely outside of the box. Where he had once thought of her methods as shortcuts or tricks, he now saw them for what they truly were: innovative, clever, and effective. One day, after class, Mr. Jackson pulled Victoria aside. "I have to admit, Stevens," he said, his voice softer than usual, "you've got a talent for this. I've been watching you for weeks now, and I can't deny it. You've got a unique way of thinking." His words were a far cry from the skepticism he'd shown earlier, and they meant more to Victoria than she could express. Her success in the classroom wasn't just about solving equations, it was about changing perceptions, including her own. Victoria had proved to herself that she was more than capable. She wasn't just the pageant girl. She was the girl who could solve complex problems, who could think critically and creatively, and who could inspire others to do the same. Then came the opportunity that would truly test her abilities. One afternoon, the school principal called Victoria into her office. "Victoria," she said, her voice warm but filled with importance, "I'd like to extend an invitation to you. We've been selected to represent the school in the upcoming national math competition. Your accomplishments in class have not gone unnoticed. You've earned this opportunity." Victoria's heart raced. It was a huge honor, one that she never expected. She knew this was a chance to prove herself even further, not just to her classmates, but to the whole school. She immediately thought of her parents, her mother, who had supported her every step of the way, and her father, who had always encouraged her to chase her dreams. Her parents were ecstatic when they heard the news. They knew how hard Victoria had worked, how much she had grown since that first day of skepticism. Her mother, a former pageant queen herself, beamed with pride, but she was quick to remind Victoria that this was not just about winning. It was about showing the world who she truly was. The day of the competition arrived, and Victoria stood at the front of the auditorium, ready to face the challenges ahead. Mr. Phillip, her beloved advanced math teacher, was there to cheer her on. He had supported her from the very beginning, recognizing her talent before anyone else. With him was the school principal, who had always believed in her. Victoria walked onto the stage with her head held high. The competition was fierce, with the brightest students from all over the country competing for the title. But for Victoria, this was more than just a competition. It was the culmination of everything she had worked for. It wasn't about winning for the sake of winning. It was about showing herself and everyone else that she belonged, that she could do this. When the results came in, Victoria had not only excelled, but had placed in the top 3. Her performance was beyond impressive, and the entire school erupted in applause when her name was called. It was a victory not just for her, but for everyone who had doubted her, for everyone who had underestimated her abilities. Years later, Victoria's success only grew. She continued to break barriers, using her intelligence, creativity, and determination to pave the way for her dreams. She became a role model for young girls everywhere, showing them that beauty, brains, and hard work could all go hand in hand. And as a young woman in her early 30s, she found herself standing alongside a respected governor aspirant, someone who had been her mentor, her guide, and eventually her partner. Victoria had risen from the skepticism and doubt, proving that intelligence and determination would always speak louder than anyone's expectations. She had found her place in the world, not just as the pageant girl, but as a brilliant, confident young woman who was unapologetically herself. Her journey was a testament to the power of believing in oneself, no matter the obstacles in your way. And most importantly, she had learned that true success isn't measured by the accolades you receive, but by the impact you have on others and the confidence you carry within yourself. Victoria's journey reminds us that we should never let others define our worth, especially when they doubt us. Her story is about overcoming obstacles, staying true to yourself, and believing in your own abilities. What do you think of Victoria's journey? Let us know in the comment. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs a little inspiration today. It is worth soul lifting. See you